Hello and welcome to the Moving Pathways Forward podcast series. Your host for today's podcast is Judith Allen Press, Principal Scientist at Apt Associates and Director of Technical Assistance for the Moving Pathways Forward project. Our featured guest today is Nate Anderson, Program Director at Jobs for the Future. Mr. Anderson will discuss Accelerating Opportunity, a national effort to improve the success rates of students enrolled in adult basic education. He'll talk about the importance of interagency partnerships, the types of state systems that must be in place to support career pathways, and key factors that facilitated the implementation of career pathways in accelerating opportunity states.
Good afternoon, Nate. It's a pleasure to have you here today and to talk with us about your experience with the Accelerating Opportunity Initiative. Why don't you begin by explaining what the initiative was and some of its key features?
Great. Thanks for having me, Judy. The Accelerating Opportunity Initiative is a expansion of Washington State's IBEST model based on a number of key data findings and evaluations of that approach to adult education. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a number of other large national foundations came together to support an expansion of that model in what was originally 5 states and has since grown to 7 states that are all at a state level attempting to scale that particular approach.
Great. And talk for a few minutes about what were the key findings about states' development of interagency partnerships.
So, historically, the states that we were working with did not have a strong integrated system of allowing the 3 partnership organizations, so the workforce system, the community college system, and adult education, did not often have a strong sort of structural framework for bringing those 3 groups together. So they had to do a lot of work at the state level with policy and sort of implementation efforts there, as well as at the local levels to create a more seamless partnership across the 3. So let me first say a little bit about some of the contractual agreements that they had. Those sort of fell into 2 categories. There were memorandums of understanding, which were essentially just agreements about roles and responsibilities, how the funding for the initiative would work, the kind of resources that each of the partners would make available, the expected outcomes that they would see from it, and those different agencies would sign those memorandums of understanding early on in the initiative to kind of drive the work. The other in some ways more challenging aspect of the sort of contractual side was more around data sharing agreements, and that was because the initiative required that the partnership organizations be able to track students from adult education into post-secondary, into the community college system, and then into the labor market. So they needed UI wage record data to do that. And in many cases, those agreements were not in place historically or previously, so they had to negotiate them. So very complex legal process to be able to do that.
And what were some of the factors that enabled the states to work collaboratively?
It, like many initiatives like this that are complex, I think it really started with having strong leadership in place at all 3 of the partner organizations to be able to do that. This type of model, this initiative was moving adult education into the post-secondary environment, and so that was a culture shift on both parts, and so we needed people who were able to drive that. We also required that the states that applied for this have their adult education system within the community college system, the same governance structure, which actually we found over time was not really a requirement. It's something that you can do in any kind of setup. So that was a key lesson for us, that there's not a policy restriction there. We also found that there had to be a willingness to discuss and share resources, particularly funding. Was a major issue. When we ran this initiative, when we started the initiative, there was no provision within Pell, or that provision had just been removed within Pell, that allowed for individuals to pay for tuition who did not have a high school diploma or GED, which is roughly half of the people we serve in this initiative. So the state partners had to come together and to put on the table the resources that they had to be able to cover those costs as well as additional costs. So it was you had to be willing to make sacrifices as part of this partnership. So WIA dollars was a big part of that. The community colleges had to waive tuition often for students that were going through, access things like Perkins to be able to pay for some of those costs as well, bring in other partnerships. So that was a very important piece of the process.
So at the end of the day, as the states evolved through accelerating opportunity activities, what types of state systems were in place for supporting ongoing career pathways activities?
So some of the biggest changes we saw, I'll say a little bit more about funding. One of my favorite examples of the ways in which we saw real change in the state came from Kansas, which was one of our partners in this, and they managed to build on what was originally Senate Bill 155, which made $1,000 available for high school students that earned a post-secondary credential. The college was incentivized to assist with that by receiving the $1,000 stipend. They took that same model and applied it to adult ed. And so the legislators in the state came and backed a bill that allowed for $1.9 million to be made available for reimbursement for colleges that helped an adult ed student earn a post-secondary credential that was on their approved list, as well as $500 to go to the GED provider for that individual who earned the GED. So it was really incentivizing that integrated pathway model. In addition, they passed a second piece of legislation that also covered tuition costs for individuals that were in this case, accelerating opportunity pathways in the state, so that you were hitting on both the financial incentive for earning the credential and an incentive to take care of the problem with not having access to Pell. So that was, I think, a great outcome of the project.
Fabulous example. That's great. So let's talk for a few minutes about your findings concerning the delivery of career pathway services from the perspective of ABE programs in community college systems. So talk for a minute about the range of services that were provided under career pathways in the accelerating opportunities sites.
So the accelerating opportunity model is it's similar to a lot of other career pathway initiatives. So it has wraparound student services as a key component. It has stackable credentials as a key component. It has partnership with the workforce system as a key component. So the things that you are very familiar with. The things I think that are somewhat different about the model and make a difference in the success for students that are in it. One is that, I think most people know this by now, but one is that it's a team-taught model. So the individuals that are in it receive at least 25% of all their coursework that they do is a team-taught course. So they have an adult ed instructor and a CTE instructor. And actually a key finding around that was that there is such thing as highly effective team teaching, and there is such thing as ineffective team teaching, and we had to learn a lot about what that meant. But then in addition to that, the students receive supplemental services, so contextualized supplemental instruction, which is where they will attend class with the adult ed instructor outside of the CTE classroom, and they spend time working on both their basic skills in general as well as their GED, and apply what they've learned in the CTE classroom, as well as ask questions that they may not have been comfortable asking in that classroom. So it really opened up opportunities for them there. In addition to that, I think Accelerating Opportunity was really successful because of the degree of career counseling that was brought into the model. Because these individuals are from the front end placed in these career and technical education courses, they need to be thinking about career pathways. They need to be thinking about the job market. They need to be thinking about opportunities once they leave. And because all of the content is contextualized to that, it's very clear to them where they're going. It's very clear to them what their sort of wage opportunities are. As much as we could, we encouraged colleges to get them out into the workforce and do some work-based learning or job shadowing or internships. So having that component really clarified, why is the individual there? It's not just the GED; it's beyond that. I think that made a big difference.
So was the career counseling a required component then of all of the sites in the states?
It is. How it was delivered depended a lot on the state. So in some cases, it was done through the community college's typical career counseling system. In some cases, it was through the workforce system that would provide it. Very rarely was it through adult ed. It almost always came from the other partners to be able to provide that. But yeah, it was an expectation.
Great. Talk for a minute about some of the challenges that the service providers encountered in delivering career pathways and how they addressed the challenges.
So there were a number. I'll start with the costs, because that was certainly one that people talked about a lot. And we've learned a lot about this as the initiative has gone on, which has been great. So one big challenge, as I mentioned earlier, was that there was not a clear federal funding source, or at least the regular federal funding source to pay for tuition costs, which is Pell. And so we had thousands of students, therefore, that had to find other ways to pay for that piece. And so we did a lot of work with the states around braided funding, and every one of the states had to develop a braided funding plan, brought partners to the table, both the state and local levels, to help address this issue of the tuition gap, as well as other costs. It wasn't just tuition. And what it led to was a significant expansion of the partnership over time. A great example, again, I'll point to Kansas at the state level, was they brought their Health and Human Services department to the table to discuss essentially individuals served by that department, how they could be better aligned with the pathways that Accelerating Opportunity offered. What came of that was a much more intentional partnership there, where the TANF agency in the state made available $1.7 million to pay for tuition costs for TANF eligible individuals who also would want to enroll in those pathways. So Kansas really moved forward with that approach. The other piece around cost was we have more recently been doing a lot of return on investment work looking at this. And the initial findings there have been that because these are adult ed students, and adult education students depends on the state, but the majority of adult education students do not go on to post-secondary education, and an even more significant number do not go on to earn a credential of any sort as part of that. So because they're essentially a population that does not go to college, if you then move them into post-secondary pathways and they're paying tuition and they are earning state FTE, if that's the model they're going off of, they're generating new revenue for the college that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Right.
So when you start to look at the ROI numbers, the return on investment numbers, it looks like the model is a positive, a net gain for the college, which is what we are going to use to make the case around why colleges need to be investing in these models, even though it's adult education students. Not to mention that the outcomes are fantastic, but that's a good reason.
That's a desirable pipeline for the college.
Yes, exactly. And in a time of dropping enrollments and so on nationwide. So.
Terrific. Okay, our final question concerns the factors that facilitated the implementation of career pathways. And what did you find concerning that?
So I'll go back to the team teaching issue. So what we originally did, not intentionally, but because there were so many components to try to juggle with this initiative, was Washington State provided initial guidance on team teaching, which over time they did a lot of professional development around this. They did a great job. They really transformed a lot of the team teaching models, but there just was too much information early on for the team teachers to really understand at the local level. And so a lot of these teams were put together last minute. The team teaching pairs had never met each other. Sometimes they were told they were going to do this and weren't volunteering. Sometimes it was the wrong sector or occupation that they were looking at. And so we found very quickly that there were examples of team teaching that weren't at all fitting within what we had thought or expected the model to be. So things like the adult ed instructor would be there to take notes, or the adult ed instructor would be only contributing in the classroom when the CT instructor called on them to say something. So it wasn't an actual team teaching pair, it was more like instructor and assistant kind of relationship. So once we spent with Washington State's help and NCTN's, we really focused on that issue, did a lot of professional development around it, provided a lot of sort of competencies around what is a good team teaching pair, online resources, which you can find at SBCTC's site, which is Washington State's system office, where they actually videoed a classroom, a team teaching pair with commentary on what is excellent there. So once we've seen that get stronger and stronger and stronger, it's remarkable the transformation you see in the classroom and the effect that it has on students in terms of their persistence, their GPAs, and so on. A good team teaching pair almost finishes each other's thoughts. I mean, it's seamless in the classroom. And they have sometimes hilarious relationships because they've been doing this for so long. But it's very effective once you get to that level. So that's, I think, a very key part of what makes this model effective.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Nate. Very interesting and great commentary.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening today. We hope you'll tune in to all 4 of the podcasts in the Moving Pathways Forward series, accessible from the Links Ed, LINCS-ED YouTube channel. For more resources on career pathways, as well as news about upcoming events, join us as a subscriber in the Career Pathways Exchange, a weekly email digest of the Moving Pathways Forward project.